This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good morning. The handout is very important because I'll be talking about a number of texts in these Neo-Latin calendar poems, so please fish out your handout, otherwise the talk may be less intelligible. I'd like to thank the organizers for including me in this stimulating conference. And I'd like to just begin, since I'm the first speaker, to picking up on what John North introduced yesterday, which was to look at Ovid's calendar for some sign about how we should proceed for the day, which I did duly this morning. And for the 8th of March, the day after the Nones, Ovid has not anything quite as picturesque touchstone for our proceedings, but still, nonetheless, a very evocative entry, which is on the constellation of the crown, Corona. And he said, "Tonight, if you look up in the sky, you will see the crown of Ariadne." And he proceeds to tell the myth of Ariadne being rescued on the beach by Bacchus, called Liber by the Romans. And of course, as students of the Fasti know, most of these star myths are inaccurate. And of course, we're in London, where if you look up in the sky, you're not likely to see Corona or anything else on a night like tonight. But still, it's nice to think about things like that as we enter into to talking about the reception of the Fasti. During the past 20 years or so, Ovid's Fasti has undergone a major reappraisal from classical scholars, but we've only begun to understand the complex reception of this elegiac calendar poem. The work's reception in Latin extends at least from the Peristephanon of Prudentius in the 4th century, which versified a number of martyrs' feast days in what was then the emerging Christian calendar, to the Frenchman Claude Barthélemy Morisot's ambitious composition in the 17th century of the missing 6 books of Ovid's versified year, July through December, in 3,964 original elegiac verses. It was during the Renaissance that the Fasti exercised the most substantial and diverse influence. A period of intense activity centered in Rome and in Florence during the late Quattrocento. In 1481, Poliziano lectured on the Fasti at the studio of Lorenzo de' Medici, and his collected notes, Collectania in Enarrationem Fastorum, testify to Politian's extensive work in elucidating the customs and myths mentioned by Ovid. Within the same Florentine milieu, painters turned to some apparently original stories from the Fasti, as well as, including, by the way, that one that I just mentioned of Ariadne being rescued on the beach, as well as, of course, the myriad tales from the Metamorphoses. In fact, Botticelli in Primavera brilliantly refashioned Ovid's brief account of the goddess Flora's identity in May as a metamorphosis, simultaneously depicting a la Daphne, the transformation of the nymph Chloris into the floral deity as she is chased by Zephyr. A decade or so later, Piero di Cosimo rendered the Fasti's 2-stage narrative of Bacchus inventing honey, also in the month of March, in a lively serio-comic diptych that features the drunken, mischievous Silenus. And meanwhile in Venice, Bellini memorably reoriented Ovid's story of Priapus and Lotus in his Feast of the Gods, later modified by Titian. In Rome, the focal point, again starting in the 1480s, was the so-called Roman Academy of Pomponio Leto, under whose influence, as Angela Fritzen has shown, first Paolo Marsi and then Antonio Costanzi produced commentaries on Ovid's Fasti. These were later combined into a joint edition, which was often reprinted during the next 30 years. Both commentators' special interest was antiquarianism of the sort that we saw illustrated yesterday by Frank Colson in some of the comments in that Ibis commentary that he has brought to our attention. But both commentators also acknowledged a political significance of Ovid's elegy in arguing for the supremacy of the Christian church. At the same time, Leto's Academy seems to have given rise to a humanist poetic genre, conspicuously based on Ovid's Fasti, the Christian calendar poem. The first Sacri Fasti came from the hand of Lodovico Lazzarelli around 1484, followed a few years later by Lorenzo Bonincontri's Fasti, written in a mixture of meters. Poets with other affiliations continued the genre in the Cinquecento. The celebrated Carmelite Baptista Mantuanus published a Fasti near the end of his life, 1516, which saw 11 reprintings later in the century. Perhaps to be expected of the one whom Erasmus called Christian Virgil, Mantuan eschewed Ovid's elegiacs for continuing dactylic hexameters. In 1547 appeared Ambrogio Fracco's exuberant Sacri Fasti, followed in 1544 by the Fasti of Girolamo Chiaravacci. Both of these adhered to the Ovidian precedent of elegiacs, and both were dedicated to Pope Paul III. Thereafter, Neo-Latin calendrical poetry emerged in France. The Benedictine Hugues Vaillant, his Fasti in 1674, and even in the Protestant North, where the Fasti Ecclesiae Christianae by a professor in Rostock named Nathan Kutrias reacted critically to the Catholic perspective of Mantuan, as well as to Ovid's pagan antiquity. In the vernacular literatures, too, Ovid's Fasti made an impact, invoked in England by Spenser, Herrick, and Milton, as Maggie Kilgore has shown, in Spanish by Cervantes, and in Italian by Sforza Pallavicino, whose Fasti Sacri aimed to rival the modern Latin poetic calendars, but which remained unfinished, just like Ovid's Fasti. In a few previous papers, I've explored a few aspects of this rich reception history of the Fasti in the Renaissance by offering first an overview of the Latin calendar poem with a particular focus on Lazzarelli, with a brief study of Fracco's Ovidianism, and with an analysis of those two paintings by Piero di Cosimo that I mentioned. Today, I'm returning to the poetic calendars for a different sort of look. I'm going to look at how 4 of these calendars present the first day of the year, especially in response to Ovid's own account of the first day of the Roman year, which features the first month's eponymous deity, Janus. In a vivid display of his access to divine inspiration, Ovid imagines the two-faced Janus appearing before him at home in order to answer his various questions about both the deity himself and the first day's ritual ceremonies. In a long sequence of responses to the curious antiquarian poet, Janus discourses on matters ranging from his own double form, his function and name, to the reason for various sacral customs on January 1st, to why Romans closed the shrine of Janus when at peace, but opened it during wartime. As the god of beginnings in various ways for the Romans, one began prayers with Janus, he's the god of entrances, even of the cosmos. Ovid's Janus stepping forth on the year's first day is fittingly encoded with the poetic agenda of the Fasti, and this is well appreciated in, for example, contributions by Philip Hardy, Mary Labate, and others. The encounter sets the pattern for the many interviews to come between the calendrical poet and other divinities. Abiding themes are forcefully announced in this dialogue, such as peace, Augustan Empire, as is the poem's deep engagement with the Aitia of Callimachus. The first day of the year is no less an important programmatic moment for the Christian calendar poets. The very choice of which day to put at the head of a poetic calendar might be making a statement, while that issue was being contested on the continent before Pope Gregory reformed the calendar in 1582. Bone and Country, for instance, both reflects a regional variant and initiates a chain of associations when he begins his calendar poem with December 25th, Christmas. The day's first day is otherwise heavily charged poetically for all the humanist calendar poets, not least for how it forcefully demonstrates the meaning of Ovid's ancient pagan Fasti for the project of a Christian Fasti Sacri. Now, if you look at your handout, I'm going to begin with B. Lazzarelli, a few remarks on him. When Lazzarelli takes up the year's first day in his Fasti Christianae Religionis, it is not January 1, but Advent Sunday, the first day of the ecclesiastical year. Among the Latin poetic calendars, Lazzarelli's has a unique structure, comprising as it does not the usual 12 books, one for each month, but 16. The first 3 he dedicates to the movable feasts, like Advent Sunday, Easter, the Ascension. Then 12 devoted to the Church's celebrations of fixed date from March through February. He uses the antiquarian beginning. And then a final book, the 16th, on the Last Judgment. Nonetheless, on the first day of his year, Advent Sunday, Lazzarelli does follow Ovidian procedure by conjuring up a holy interlocutor. He delivers a general petition for information about the day's ritual to whomever the Omnipotent One will allow to descend from the sky. Lazzarelli explicitly does not dare to summon the divine messenger Mercury because of his pagan status, although he does apostrophize that now purely fabular divinity. Nil nunc nisi fabula restat, he says. St. Peter immediately appears to the poet. And from the start, we realize that he is replacing not so much Mercury as the divinity who manifests himself to Ovid on the first day of the ancient Roman year. Both the description and the phraseology put us in mind of Janus' epiphany in Book 1 of Ovid's poem. Peter's beard and keys are singled out, which are conspicuous attributes of Ovidian Janus. The epithet claviger, applied to the saint's hand and then to Peter himself, was invented by Ovid to describe Janus. Peter's characterization of the keys as his arma likewise reproduces the pointedly peaceful Janus' own metaphor for his single key. Just like the pagan counterpart too, the saint claims to be the caelestis janitor aulae, through whom, per me, he says, through whom humanity gains access to the celestial divine. So Peter emerges as a Christian equivalent to Janus, who is never mentioned. In Peter's explanations that follow, however, for the origin of Advent and its 4 weeks, Ovid's Janus is no longer evoked. After Lazzarelli elusively sets up St. Peter as a Janus figure, or perhaps the rival of Ovid's holy interlocutor on January 1st, the purely Christian etiology proceeds without further reference to Ovid's divine encounter on the year's first day. B. Mantuan. He meditates on the same Ovidian text quite differently in unfolding the inaugural feast of his Christian calendar poem. For him, that day is January the 1st, traditionally the feast of Christ's circumcision. prima dies nostri salvete renascitur ani, quae tamen est octava Dei lactentus ab ortu. The first day of our year is reborn, all hail, which, however, is the 8th day after the birth of God. After explaining the Christian holy day, Mantuan turns to the name of January, and thus to Janus. I've underlined these two lines which correspond. Prima dies Jani, the first day of Janus, he says, in concluding the circumcision with a kind of ring compositional echo. The first day of Janus gleams with such splendor from the feast. This leads him to gloss Janus in what is logically an appendix, but surpasses the festal description in length. And here, Mantuan takes up the subjects of Janus's first long speech to Ovid, the god's identity, name, peculiar form. But he does so in propria persona, that is, without conjuring up any sacred interlocutor. The poet reinterprets Janus's words from a biblical perspective. Janus was in fact Noah, who after the deluge traveled to the site that would be Rome, where a month and the hill, the Janiculum, memorialize his sojourn there. The name Janus is actually a corrupted form of the Latinized Assyrian word for wine, Janus. Noah is said to have invented the vine and wine, as one in fact reads in Genesis. Correspondingly, the idea of his two-faced form arose from the fact that he saw, Vidit, the two eras of the flood and its aftermath. All this Mantuan develops in language and style much less extensively indebted to Ovid's 1st of January than is Lazzarelli. There is some Ovidian color, to be sure. The movement's opening verse, for instance, which I quoted a moment ago, is a pastiche of Ovidian phrases, which you see illustrated to the right of that page of the handout. The tale of Noah Yain's trip to the place ubi nunc Roma est clearly refashions the story of Saturn's arrival, witnessed by Ovid's Janus, and marked by the same phrase. There is no doubt, however, that Mantuan is correcting Ovid point by point. Janus's previous identity was not primeval chaos, the explanation found in Ovid's Fasti, but Noah. And Janus's name and form are to be connected with that biblical identity, not with his classical function as celestial doorkeeper, or janitor. Ovidian Janus's explanation of the nautical image on Roman coinage as a memorial of Saturn, Mantuan perversely twists into proof that it was the ship of the one later called Janus that survived the deluge. This critique of Ovid's pagan calendrical etiology is cast in terms of illuminating the ignorance and misperception of antiquity in general. At the close, Mantuan notes that the ancient Greeks and Romans were deceived, faluntur, because they did not know the annals of the first ancestors. These would be the Bible. However, the word annales also glances at Ovid, who at the start of the Fasti claims that he has unearthed sacred rites from the ancient annals. Sacra annalibus errata priscis, Ovid's words. C. Fracco. Next among the Italian poetic calendars comes Ambrogio Novidio Fracco's Sacri Fasti of 1547. Fracco combines the approaches to Ovid of both Mantuan and Lazzarelli in producing perhaps the most thoroughgoing imitation of Ovid's Fasti. as his adopted name, Novidius, New Ovid, would lead one to suggest. Like Mantuan, on January 1st, he treats both the Feast of the Circumcision and the identity of Janus, but in reverse order. So that the Ovidian content is pushed to the forefront, where this poet more directly applies his Christian critique. On the other hand, like Lazzarelli, Fracco adopts the dialogue scenario and language of Ovid, but again does so much more extensively. In place of the Ovidian epiphany of Janus, Fracco enjoys a visitation from the Trinity, a triple divinity to trump the double pagan god. In both cases, the luminous apparition occurs when the poet has just taken up his writing tablet. This is a key moment that Ovid borrows from the proem to his Callimacheian model. And you can compare Fracco, hoc ego sic sumpta dicebant forte tabella, with Ovid, haec ego cum sumptis agitare menta tabellis. Moreover, Fracco engages in a long conversation with the Trinity, which exactly matches in number the 10 exchanges between Ovid and his divine interlocutor. We see from the start that Fracco simultaneously presents his ecclesiastical material in distinctly Ovidian terms and critiques Ovid's pagan religious perspective. The opening distich, this is verse 115, reorients a comment by Janus as the Christian poet turns to the present guardian of the heavenly threshold. We can take the reversal of human and divine addressees as simple variation rather than polemical in force. But Fracco then specifies that, as he puts it, and here he's sort of mildly flirting with heresy, his three-headed addressee surpasses, or three-necked addressee, surpasses divine Janus in aspect, super res. The poet himself, likewise, in the next distich, is implicitly claiming to outstrip the poetic project announced in the opening verse of Ovid's Fasti. Fracco's subject is the true festivals, sacra vera, along with their etiologies, and the constellations now fixed, not rising and falling, in God's sky, kailo tuo. Most remarkable of all, and this is true of the whole of Fracco's Sacri Fasti, his ensuing initial queries to the Trinity not only match, but actually repeat Ovid's first questions to Janus. The Christian God is asked to explain his own triple form, as was Janus's unique bifrontal shape, but also, and first of all, to elucidate the origin and identity of the month's two-headed eponymous divinity. It's as if Fracco is not satisfied with the classical god's own explanation of himself. So for the truth, he invites the perspective of the deity who replaces Janus at the head of a proper calendar poem. That god, he says, was obscure to his own people. This blend of close structural imitation and theological correction of Ovid continues throughout the conversation. Again, at the start of the exchange, for instance, this is verse 139, note Trinity's first words to Fracco. The frightened poet is encouraged to lay aside his fear, as is Ovid by Janus's first words. But at the same time, the appellation pointedly revises Juno's later address to Ovid as the Vates Romani conditor anni. Fracco is said to write of a better year as the Vates melioris conditor anni. We may remember yesterday in Professor Monewald's paper that one of her poets used this phrase in his prose introduction, or a phrase very much like this, by saying, sumus vates, we are, or I am, a poet, materia meliore. Exactly the same idea of having the Christian substance of the Christian poet was better, somehow better. And here, it's a better year that Fracco is singing of. Likewise, Trinity's countering self-assertions about his own identity repeatedly allude polemically to the start of Janus's account of himself. The latter begins, me chaos antiqui nam sum res prisca vocabant, aspice quam longi temporis acta canam. In a cutting one-upsmanship, the Trinity starts with the fact that he is before chaos, ante chaos cum sim. And a few couplets later comes his sharp rejoinder to the Ovidian pentameter. The primeval events, or longi temporis acta, which Janus claimed for himself, this language clearly distorts Janus's words for rhetorical effect, were in fact God's own six-day cosmogonic works, known from Genesis' account of creation. Fracco's Trinity voices the idea found in Mantuan that Janus is a fictitious corruption of Noah Iain. In addition, like Lazzarelli, he highlights St. Peter as a Christian counterpart to Janus. But in both cases, Fracco makes clear that he is reading Ovid's Janus allegorically. Janus's shape is taken to arise from ignorant antiquity's mistaken construal of the double aspect of God's creation. In the case of St. Peter, Janus is said to be a rerum figura, just as in this respect was Noah before him. These two prefigured the heavenly ship, sideriam ratem, of Peter, symbolizing the church, and his keys to heaven. Again, the Ovidian Janus's description of himself is arrogated for the sanctified apostle. The double deity proudly declared, Praesideo foribus caeli, I oversee the doors of the sky, which Trinity pointedly applies to the Christian celestial doorkeeper. Praesidet hic foribus caeli. The demonstrative pronoun furthers the intertextual dialectic. It is this one, not Janus, who guards the heavenly doorway. A few couplets later, Ovidian phrasing is appropriated for a similar effect in the picture of St. Peter's vast bilateral range of vision, taking in both east and west, where the play on Janus's name, too, underscores that the pagan divinity has been supplanted by the saint. And St. Peter's vantage point, or rather vantage points, doubly trump Janus, who has been made to surrender not only his heavenly superintendence as caeli ianitor, but also his eponymous hill, whence we are no doubt to imagine the apostle gazing out from the church of San Pietro in Montorio on the Giunicolo. At the same time, the saint's far-reaching view over the earth echoes the Trinity's own threefold perspective claimed earlier, which in turn rivals Janus's claim to look in two, but only two, directions without moving. The Trinity's assertion also mischievously alludes to Janus's own divine comparandum for his peculiar form, namely Hecate, who turns her faces in three directions at once. The true triple deity has transvaluated that comparison, in effect, turning it on its head. Now, as in Ovid's Fasti, the Trinity's epiphany to Fracco on the first day of the year is but the first of several holy apparitions to the poet, for which the initial encounter serves as a kind of template. To come will be meetings with, for instance, the Blessed Virgin, and a trio of muses, and there are others. Such entrance upon Franco's stage by both pagan and Christian authorities finds an even more complex form in the last calendar poem that I would like to discuss today, namely the Cremonan Girolamo Chiaravacci's Fasti Sacri of 1554, where pagan and Christian authorities appear alongside one another. And that conjunction is emblematic, I think, of Chiaravacci's stance towards Ovid and pagan antiquity. I discovered this text of Chiaravacci only recently, and so am bringing it to your attention as much to gain feedback as to cast light on it. In the poem's opening movement, Chiaravacci asks the muses to inspire his poem about the sacred days, noting, by the by, that an unnamed Ille, who is of course Ovid, left his work only begun when he died. One of the muses straightway appears, saying, first of all, that the poet should really consult Moses, widely revered as lawgiver, and who will reveal the celestial region. The muse casts inspirational stuff upon the poet's head, which he internalizes, and Eke, Moses, appears before him, brilliantly arrayed and accompanied by what looked to be the personified year, days, and hours, and with Pallas Athena, too, at his side. This rather busy scene is loosely modeled on Janus's simpler apparition to Ovid when he was taking up his writing tablets to begin the Fasti. You remember Franco appealed to the same scene. You can see the verbal correspondences on your handout. But here it is Pallas rather than Moses, the Janus figure suddenly appearing, who first instructs Chiaravacci, Illa regit vatem. She guides the poet, or the vates, which has a kind of double meaning throughout this whole part, because it also applies to Moses in places. Pallas reveals to the poet the stars and explains the zodiac signs, going on for 150 verses. The scene is not explicitly set on the first day of the year, as in the other calendars, but is similarly obsessed with beginnings, including the start of the year. Eventually, Moses himself speaks. He takes up the matter of the year, again in phraseology that echoes Janus addressing etiologies to Ovid. Accipe quaesiti vates tibi tempora mensis. Tempora non uno carmina nota tibi. We've not actually heard the poet ask about the month quaesiti mensis. Moreover, Moses' capacious knowledge extends to what Chiaravacci has read. His reference to more than one poem points beyond the Fasti to Ovid's Metamorphoses, whose account of creation and early human life provides the narrative structure for Moses' Aition. This acknowledges the relationship between the two Ovidian poems long before Richard Heinze, even as the two texts are being revised. Moses opens by characterizing primeval matter just as Janus did when he started to explain his own origin as chaos, unus acervus erat. But the Hebrew prophet thinks of the ingredients more in terms of the Metamorphoses account of creation, earth, sea, sky. And it's a biblical version of the latter narrative that Moses then expounds. There was a golden age, as in Ovid, whose end was marked by Cain's slaughter of Abel. God called a divine council, just as did Ovid's Jupiter, once again to announce a flood. And this brings us once more to Noah. who, however, does not turn out to be Janus, as in other Christian Fasti. Here we're told that among his inventions after the deluge, wine for instance, Noah divided the year according to the movements of the sun. Ille tibi ad solis cursus duviserat annum. There's only a vague parallel for this in Genesis 8:13, in that Noah beheld dry land again on the first day of the first month of the new year. But according to Chiaravacci's Moses, Noah is responsible for establishing the months of the year, an achievement that for the Romans, of course, Ovid's Fasti attributes to Romulus. Next, the poet asks what the first day signifies or means. Dic mihi magna pater, he asks Moses, dic rerum maxima vates, quid vult prima sibi mensa recepta dies. Note that here, Moses is the one called Vates, so he's a kindred of to the poet. And note, too, that his upward gaze recalls both the posture of the muse as she inspired Chiaravacci and the global gaze of Janus at the close of his conversation with Ovid. After reviewing some items in Jewish history and culture, Moses focuses on a custom addressed also by Ovid's Janus, namely the gift of money on the year's first day. His etiology for the practice is not unlike that given by Janus for gifts at Rome on January 1st, so that the rest of the year may follow in a joyful spirit. But in this case, a second etiology is appended: the birth of Christ from the pure virgin. Presumably this means that the cash gifts commemorate the nativity celebrated a few days ago. Moses soon modulates into the Lord's circumcision, the traditional ecclesiastical feast of January 1st, and Jesus is said thus to claim the day and to claim the year for himself. Vendicat illa diem, primus sibi vendicat annum. The Jewish Vates apostrophizes the day, salve festa dies, echoing Ovid's address to January 1st as the installation at the installation day, as the installation day of Rome's consuls, salve laeta dies. Only the worldwide power of Rome, encoded in the pagan occasion, has been transmuted to the celebrated status of the corresponding Christian feast throughout the entire world. Eventually, the curious poet inquires after the source of the first month's name, which brings Moses to Janus and to Roman history. As do the other humanistic Fasti, he highlights the story of the exiled Saturn's arrival in Latium by ship, which Janus tells Ovid in order to explain the boat inscribed on some Roman coinage. Chiaravacci elevates the status of Janus above what the god claimed for himself, making him a seemingly greater power in Latium in those days, the very one who installed Saturn in a new kingdom, as well as himself producing the commemorative coinage. This goes beyond even the similar version in Mantuan. Ovid's Janus rather follows up his reminiscence of Saturn's arrival in Italy with reflection on how he resided at the same time on the hill now called Janiculum from his name. Moses instead links the visualization of Saturn in Saturnia Tellus. This microphone is it okay? Can you hear me?
In general it was okay, you just lost it then.
Okay. Is it back? Okay. I think you have to speak into it. Moses instead links the memorialization of Saturn in the Saturnia Tellus with that of Janus in the name of the year's first month. Adapting another passage in Fasti 1, Caravaggio has Moses state that the early Patres called the first month after Janus, but that Romulus instead gave that honor to his own father, Mars, when he divided the year into 10 months. Romulus erroris nescius ipsa sui. Early on in the Fasti, this is 127 and following, Ovid describes Romulus' mistaken 10-month year, with his father Mars' month at the head. And the poet speculates on the reasons for this error in an apostrophe to Caesar. Surely we're meant to think here of Julius Caesar, the reformer of the calendar, as well as of Augustus or Tiberius or Germanicus. King Numa, Ovid goes on to say, prefixed to the 10 an additional 2 months, with Janus honored at the start. Moses, however, attributes the correction of this calendrical problem not to Numa, but to Caesar, who is said to have named the first month after Janus as the beginning for Romulus's institution. Principium rebus Romula magna tuis. Capping the substitution, the Ovidian address to Caesar becomes an apostrophe to Romulus. All in all, like Fracco and to a lesser extent Lazzarelli, Caravaggio is deeply engaged with the language, the techniques, and the content of the Ovidian Janus' epiphany to the poet on the first day of the year. Unlike his humanistic confreres, however, and that includes Mantuan, Caravaggio is not really polemical vis-a-vis Ovid's Fasti as an embodiment of pagan antiquity's account of sacred time. Here, the Greek goddess Pallas Athena and an unnamed muse share the stage with Moses as the poet's revered authorities. Moses is cast in the mold of Ovid's Janus without dissonance. Biblical episodes from Genesis and elsewhere, Noah, Abel, Moses' own Decalogue, he actually gives the 10 Commandments in elegiac couplets, are integrated into the Ovidian narratives of Earth's prehistory. The alternative idea for cash gifts on January 1st to ensure a happy year, as in Ovid, and to commemorate Christ's birth, don't seem to conflict with one another. The one explicit reference to calendrical error by Romulus is said to have been corrected by Caesar, not by Catholic doctrine, again in contradistinction with the other Sacri Fasti. Fracco, as we saw, everywhere juxtaposed Christian and Ovidian antiquities, but always with an edge of theological critique. But Caravaggio, in his blending of traditions, may have been influenced by Hermeticism, which much occupied the thinkers of the day. Lazzarelli, for instance, translated the Hermetic texts into Latin, as had Ficino more famously before him. Cosmology and astrology, as well as the authority of Moses, also loom large in the Hermetic tradition. Whatever its source, at least to judge from this long, rambling episode, the relative lack of Christian contestation of pagan religion seems to be a hallmark of Caravaggio's Fasti. My survey of the Neo-Latin calendrical poem in Italy, then, perhaps fittingly ends with a text that for once exudes a harmony between Ovid as progenitor of the genre of calendrical poetry and Ovid as the source of lore about ancient Rome's religious calendar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great handout and very interesting. Congratulations on the discovery as well.
Yeah, I discovered it about a month ago.
Were you feeling that the poets were consciously playing off each other? That there was an acknowledgement of one of the other, or was that more implied?
Well, it's that's hard to answer. I would say they do seem to be playing off one another, or of some common tradition, in that this focus on Noah, for example, is something that they share in common. I know that there is a previous tradition of Janus being connected with Noah in some of the late medieval tour guides of Rome. But there it's the children of Noah who are identified with Janus rather than Noah himself. So this is a later development. I think that clearly the later poets are looking to Mantuan, who was, a great figure as a poet. But aside from that, it's hard to say. But they are playing with some of the same motifs. They come back to some of the same scenes, or some of the same parts of Ovid's scene. For example, taking up the tablets, that initial scene in Ovid, the ship of Saturn. They keep recapitulating that. The coinage that is commemorated by that. So either they are picking up somebody's commentary, let's say, who is evoking Ovid in describing the first day of the year in a Christian context, or they're responding to one another. The only ways that I could demonstrate that it is really verbally corresponding is in reference to Mantuan. Yes, in the back, Ingo?
Well, thank you very much. Just a question out of complete ignorance, but since you mentioned the relationship between the Fasti and the Metamorphoses, and perhaps also with reference to the end of your passage from Antoine, where the Annales are mentioned.
Yes.
The Fasti and Metamorphoses sort of relate to each other in a complementary fashion, a cyclical version of time focused on the always recurring year, whereas the Metamorphoses give you a linear version of time that sort of trace sort of the Historia Sacra, history, if you will. And I'm wondering whether that sort of combination of two different modes of thinking about how to conceptualizing time is involved in the calendar forms that you've been looking at as well.
The last of them, Chiaravaci, is where there is clearly a verbal relationship, and not only a verbal relationship, a deep structural relationship with the whole first sequence of Ovid's Metamorphoses, conflated with the bits about Janus' chaos and the origin of creation. So there, it's one can talk about it as definitely being related to a reading of Ovid. More generally, I think the answer is probably yes. It's not something that I've studied. As I said, I only came to this Chiaravaci rather recently, and there it's explicit. But I think probably in Lazzarelli's reconceptualization of time, in his poem, that there is perhaps some deeper reading of Ovid more generally. And Lazzarelli, although I didn't make him the most conspicuous imitator of Ovid, he was a deep reader of Ovid. And so this idea of, in his case, a 16-book poem, going beyond Ovid's poem by 1 year, and rethinking the whole idea of how time is organized by first presenting the movable feasts, which are, of course, a distinct category in the Fasti themselves, but here he strips it out by putting all the movable feasts together, then the 12 months, and then the Last Judgment, which, of course, is another way of looking at time, the end of time, if you will. And so Lazzarelli is deeply meditated on Ovid, and for example, he included in his calendar, in the month of March, our month, Ovid's birthday. He wrote Ovid's birthday into a Christian calendar poem, and even says that Ovid you could tell he's wringing his hands that Ovid wasn't Christian, because he was almost Christian, because he invented the calendar poem. And in honesty, I haven't reflected on it much until I came across this Chiaravaci, but that's a great question, and I think it will repay further thought. Perhaps in the next 3 months when my paper is due. Caroline.
I had a question about, I was struck by the use of Noah, and also like the allusion to Saturn and
Yes.
sort of the setting up. And so I was wondering if there was something about a restart of mankind or a golden age allusion in the openings of the different versions.
A restart of time, in the fact that when it's funny, in Ovid it's not so much, well, in the Fasti version he doesn't so much connect him with the golden age there as he is, we think of in the Aeneid, for example. He's more connected with it, but clearly it's his arrival is a new beginning for Italy in Ovid's thinking of things. So yes, I would say, to the extent that they are taking that moment as a way to reflect on beginning, of the beginning of the year, where it's the beginning of a new phase in Rome. And in the Fasti, you may recall, it's just full of etymologies for the naming of Latium, from hiding, him hiding in Italy, and the Saturnia Tellus coming from Saturn, and so forth. So to the extent, I don't think it's necessarily from the Golden Age, but just the idea of the beginning of Rome, certainly picking up that in. But on the other hand, this is like Ingo Gildenhardt's question. It certainly would appear to invite such reflection, and maybe there is something there in the deep structure that I haven't really penetrated yet, because the flood, of course, is a re-beginning. After the flood, humanity begins again. Saturn does mark a new beginning when he comes to Italy. So the juxtaposition of those two, and the fact that the Christian poets glom onto that, suggests they were perhaps thinking of it in those terms. So probably the answer is yes, but I haven't really thought about it deeply.
We can't take all the questions we want on, but I'm going to choose John and then.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I'll try to answer more briefly too. I'm
still on time, but in a different way. Ovid, if I remember correctly, finishes up with this enormous reflection on money and avarice.
Yes.
Which is a story of decline from primitive Rome.
Right.
When the coin may have been just a tiny symbol, but now it's compared with honey, isn't it? Honey
right.
is sweet. How can you say that money isn't sweeter than honey?
Right. He's following up. The previous question was, why do you give honey and dates on the first day of the year as a gift? And then he riffs off of that and says, well, I understand that, but what about money? And then he goes on, and his response is about, no, it doesn't. That is completely, it's complete. Right, because you would think that this would be an opportunity to rail against it. But no, in fact, that is completely airbrushed away. This is a long, if you don't know it, it's in response to that question about the money, Ovid goes on and tells a long tale about, you don't know that even back in the, in the olden days, people were avaricious and so forth. And then he says about himself, he says, even we gods like gold, and so you give the copper coin, you give the bronze, you give the os, and then but you also give us golden temples, and we like both. We like both.
Okay, last one.
I was wondering whether there's a connection between the Christian Fasti and a kind of antiquarian element in Ovid Fasti. I was struck in Franco when he asked about the insignia regni, and that seems to be picking up in a way the coin as well. Noah was a sailor, Peter was a sailor, and this is a Christian object in a way, the symbol, and it requires a kind of antiquarian explanation in a way that runs curiously parallel to the ship on the coin. And you know, it's clear in Marcis's commentary, for instance, that there's some interest in, I mean, already some of the early Christian material in Rome is itself requires antiquarian explication, and part of it's more legible in the ancient landscape, but it's not perfectly legible. And already churches are changing their name, have misleading inscriptions. And so whether these commentators all engage in a kind of establishing a parallel study of early Christian antiquity.
Yes, I think that's exactly what's going on. I think that they're taking the habit of thought that has developed out of the Fasti, which has been, you know, in the commentators that is then being mapped on their own way of reading Christianity. Yes, I think that's exactly what's going on. And you find it not only, you know, in the exactly parallel, but then there are other times in Lazzarelli, for example, near the bottom of page 1, you see that when he talks about the keys, this is the fifth line from the bottom, he says, "Eth dedit has claves, cussa quod ira notant." He talks about the keys on the Christian coins. So he's beginning to think in parallel terms about the way that coinage in the Christian world has encoded in it Christian history just as in the Roman. So yes, I think that the answer is definitely yes, they're doing that.
Okay, let's thank John.
Thank you very much.
One more time, John.